I should have walked away the second I saw him, but something in his eyes made that impossible. The rain hit hard that night, the kind that blurred streetlights into streaks of gold and turned every shadow into something deeper, darker, and I remember clutching my jacket tighter as I cut through the alley behind my building, just trying to get home before midnight, before the city changed its mood again. But then I saw him, slumped against the brick wall like he didn't belong there, like the world had misplaced him. And at first I thought he was just another drunk or someone who needed help. But when I stepped closer, I realized how wrong I was. His clothes were too sharp, too expensive, even soaked through, and his breathing, slow, controlled, like he refused to let himself fall apart even when he clearly should have. And then his hand moved, catching my wrist before I could step back, not rough, not desperate, just precise, like he knew exactly how much strength to use. And that's when he looked at me, really looked. His eyes dark and steady, not panicked, not grateful, just aware, like I had interrupted something important. "Why didn't you run?" he asked, his voice low, barely there. But it carried weight, the kind that made my chest tighten without warning, and I didn't have an answer, because I didn't even know why I was still standing there, why I hadn't turned and left like any normal person would have. But instead I knelt down beside him, ignoring the cold seeping through my jeans, ignoring the way my heart started racing, and I told him he needed help, that I could call someone, anyone. But he shook his head just slightly, like that option didn't exist in his world, like rules worked differently for him. And I realized then this wasn't just a man in trouble. This was someone dangerous, someone who lived in a world I had no business stepping into. But it was already too late, because I stayed, because I helped him sit up, because I let him lean on me as we moved inside my tiny apartment, every step slower than the last, every second stretching longer than it should have. And even as I cleaned him up with shaking hands, even as I told myself this was a mistake I couldn't undo, he never once looked afraid, not of the pain, not of me, not of anything. And that scared me more than anything else, because people like that don't just exist, they come with consequences. And I should have understood that right then, should have seen the warning in the way he memorized every detail of my face, like I was something he might need to find again, but I didn't. I just told myself I was doing the right thing, that helping someone couldn't possibly turn my life upside down. And when I finally fell asleep on the edge of the couch, exhausted and still unsure what I had just gotten myself into, I had no idea that by morning, he would be gone, and that the silence he left behind would be louder than anything that came before. I woke up before the sun, the kind of quiet that feels wrong settling over my apartment, too still, too empty. And for a second, I thought maybe I had imagined everything. The rain, the alley, him. But then I saw it. The faint crease in the couch cushion where he had been sitting, the glass of water on the table half gone, the subtle scent of something expensive lingering in the air like a memory that refused to leave. And my chest tightened because he was gone. Just like that. No goodbye, no explanation, nothing. And I told myself that was a good thing. That people like him disappearing from your life overnight was the best possible outcome. But my hands would not stop shaking as I walked through the apartment, checking every corner like I expected him to still be there watching me. And then I noticed something else, something I had not seen the night before. My door lock, slightly scratched, not broken, not forced, just adjusted, like someone had come and gone without needing permission. And that was when the unease really settled in, heavy and cold. Because normal people do not leave like that. They do not move like shadows through someone else's home. And I kept replaying his voice in my head, the way he had asked me why I did not run, like it had meant something, like my answer mattered in a way I did not understand. And I was still standing there, staring at the door, when the knock came, sharp, deliberate, not loud, but impossible to ignore. And my heart jumped so hard it actually hurt, because no one visits me at 7 in the morning. No one even knows where I live except my landlord and a coworker who would never show up unannounced. And for a second I thought about not answering, about pretending I was not home. But something told me that would not change anything, that whoever was on the other side already knew I was there. So I forced myself to move, each step, slower than the last, my hand hovering over the handle like it weighed 100 pounds. And when I finally opened the door, just a few inches at first, I saw them. 3 men standing in perfect stillness like they had been placed there, all in dark suits that fit too well to be casual, their expressions calm, controlled, not threatening, but not friendly either, and the man in the center stepped forward just slightly, enough to meet my eyes. And there was something in the way he looked at me that made my stomach drop, not curiosity, not judgment, recognition, like he had already decided who I was before I even spoke. "Miss Emily Carter," he said, my full name rolling off his tongue with unsettling precision, and my grip on the door tightened because I had never told him my name. Not him, not anyone. And the man continued, his voice even, polite in a way that felt rehearsed. "You helped someone last night." And it was not a question, it was a statement, a confirmation, and every instinct I had screamed at me to deny it, to shut the door, to pretend I did not understand, but I could not move, could not speak, because deep down I already knew this moment was coming. I just had not realized how quickly it would find me. And then he added, just quietly enough to make it worse, "He wants to see you." And something in my chest shifted, something I could not name, because it was not fear alone. It was the realization that whatever world I had brushed against last night had not let me go. It had followed me home. For a moment, I just stood there, my hand still gripping the edge of the door like it was the only thing keeping me grounded, because nothing about this felt real, not the way they said his words like they belonged to him, not the way they knew my name, not the way they waited without impatience like they had all the time in the world. And I realized something that made my chest tighten even more. This was not a request. It sounded polite, but it was not optional, and I swallowed slowly, forcing my voice to work even though it felt like it had forgotten how. Asking them who they were, what this was about. Even though I already knew the answer would not make me feel better, and the man in front gave a small, almost respectful nod, like he appreciated the question, but it did not change anything. "We work for Mr. Volkov," he said, and the name settled into the space between us like it carried weight I could not measure, and I repeated it in my head, trying to connect it to something, anything, but there was nothing familiar, just a growing sense that I had stepped into something far bigger than I understood, and I shook my head slightly, telling them there must be some mistake, that I did not know anyone by that name, that I had just helped someone who needed it, and that was all. But even as I said it, I could hear how weak it sounded, because they did not react, not surprise, not doubt, just quiet certainty, like they had already accounted for my denial. And then the man's eyes softened just enough to make it worse. "He does not forget," he said, and something about that made my stomach drop, because it did not sound like gratitude. It sounded like a fact, like a rule, and I glanced past them, noticing the car parked at the curb, black, spotless, out of place on my street where everything else looked worn and tired. And it hit me how different our worlds were, how small mine suddenly felt compared to whatever his was. And I should have closed the door right then, should have told them to leave, should have protected what little normal I had left, but instead I stepped back, just a little, enough to signal that I was not going to fight this, not because I trusted them, but because something inside me understood resistance would not change the outcome. And the man nodded once, like that was the only answer he needed. And within seconds I was grabbing my jacket with hands that still would not steady, my mind racing with questions I could not ask. And as I followed them down the narrow stairs of my building, every step felt heavier than the last, like I was walking away from something I could never get back. And when we reached the street, the morning air felt colder than it should have, sharper, like the world itself had shifted overnight. And the door of the car opened before I even reached it, smooth, practiced, and I hesitated for just a second, staring at the dark interior like it was a line I could still choose not to cross. But then I remembered his eyes, the way he had looked at me like I was already part of something, and I realized the truth I had been avoiding since the moment I found him in that alley. This was never going to end with me walking away, and as I finally stepped inside, the door closing quietly behind me, sealing me into a silence that felt too controlled, too intentional, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever waited on the other side of this ride was going to change everything. The car moved without a sound, smooth enough that I barely felt it at first. Just the quiet shift of motion as the city outside my window began to slide past in slow, controlled frames, and I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, trying not to stare at the men beside me, trying not to think about how easily they had stepped into my life like they belonged there. Like this was always going to happen, and no one spoke. Not even to each other. The silence thick, but not awkward, intentional. like words were unnecessary in their world. And I found myself watching the reflection in the tinted glass instead of the streets, catching glimpses of my own face, pale, tense, completely out of place against the dark interior. And I wondered what he saw last night when he looked at me like that. What made him remember me enough to send people after me by morning? And the question would not leave. It stayed there, pressing against my thoughts, growing heavier with every passing block, until I finally asked it, quietly, almost unsure if I should break the silence at all, asking why he wanted to see me. And the man across from me glanced up just briefly, not annoyed, not surprised, just acknowledging the question like it had been expected. Because you helped him, he said, simple, direct, but something in the way he said it made it clear that was not the whole answer. And I exhaled slowly, looking back out the window as the buildings changed, taller now, cleaner, the kind of places I usually only saw from a distance. And it struck me then how far we had already gone, how quickly my world had been replaced by his without me even noticing the exact moment it happened. And when the car finally slowed, turning into a quiet street lined with polished stone and guarded entrances, my chest tightened again, because this was not just different, this was controlled, every detail precise, every movement accounted for, and the car came to a stop in front of a building that looked less like a residence and more like something designed to keep people out. Tall glass, clean lines, nothing unnecessary, and before I could fully process it, the door beside me opened, one of the men stepping out and offering his hand, not forcing, just waiting, and I hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it, stepping onto the pavement and immediately feeling the shift in the air, quieter here, heavier, like the noise of the city had been deliberately kept at a distance. And as we moved toward the entrance, the doors opened before we even reached them, someone inside already expecting us, already prepared, and I realized then how little of this was spontaneous, how everything had been set in motion long before I understood I was part of it. And the elevator ride was no different, silent, smooth, rising higher than I was comfortable with, each floor passing like a countdown to something I could not see yet. And when the doors finally opened, I felt it before I saw him, that same presence from the night before, controlled, unshaken, and my steps slowed without me meaning to, because there he was, standing near the window with the city stretched out. Behind him, no sign of weakness, no trace of the man I had helped just hours ago, his posture straight, his gaze steady as it lifted to meet mine. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the space between us filled with something that felt heavier than silence. And then he took a step forward, measured, deliberate, his eyes not leaving mine as he said the one thing I had not expected. You should have let me go. And I felt my breath catch, because it did not sound like a warning, it sounded like a truth I was only just beginning to understand. His words settled into the room like they belonged there, calm, controlled, impossible to ignore, and I stood there trying to understand what he meant, because part of me wanted to be angry, wanted to remind him that he had been the one bleeding in an alley while I was the one who stayed. But the way he said it stripped that argument away before it could even form, like he already knew every version of what I might say. And I realized then that this was not a conversation he was having for answers. It was a statement, a boundary, something I had already crossed without permission, and I forced myself to speak anyway, asking him what that was supposed to mean, my voice steadier than I felt, because I needed something. Anything that made sense. And he watched me for a long second, not dismissing me, not rushing, just measuring, the same way he had the night before, and then he moved closer, not enough to invade my space, but enough that I could feel the shift in the air again, that same quiet pressure that followed him. People who come near me, he said slowly, like each word mattered, do not stay untouched. And the simplicity of it made my chest tighten, because there was no threat in his tone, no drama, just certainty, and I swallowed, shaking my head slightly as I told him I did not ask for any of this, that I just helped someone who needed it, that I expected to go back to my normal life after. But something flickered in his expression at that, something almost unreadable, like the idea itself did not quite exist to him, and he glanced toward the window for a moment, before looking back at me. Normal ended the moment you chose to stay, he said, and I felt that land deeper than anything else, because I knew he was right, even if I did not want to admit it, and the room went quiet again, not uncomfortable, just heavy, like everything had already shifted and we were both standing in the middle of it. And I became aware of how out of place I looked there, my worn jacket, my scuffed shoes. Every detail of me clashing against the clean, controlled world around him. And I wondered if he saw that too, if he noticed the difference the same way I did. But when he spoke again, it was not about that, not about the distance between us. It was about something else entirely. "Did anyone see you last night?" he asked. And the question caught me off guard, because it was not what I expected, not concern, not gratitude, something sharper, more focused, and I hesitated, replaying the memory in my head, the empty alley, the rain, the quiet, and I shook my head, slowly, telling him no, that no one had been there, that I was alone, and he studied me for a moment longer, like he was weighing the truth in my answer, and then he nodded once, almost to himself, like a piece of something had fallen into place, and that was when I realized this was bigger than me helping him, bigger than one night, because whatever world he lived in, it did not just react, it calculated, it planned, and I felt a chill run through me as that understanding settled in, because if he was asking those questions now, it meant something else had already started, something I could not see yet, and before I could stop myself, I asked him what would have happened if I had walked away, if I had left him there like he said I should have, and for the first time, his expression changed just slightly, not softer, not warmer, just different, like I had touched a question he did not usually entertain, and his answer came quiet, almost too quiet. "You would have been safe," and the way he said it made my chest tighten again, because it did not feel like reassurance. It felt like a line drawn between what was and what could have been, and standing there in that room, with the city stretched out behind him and his presence filling the space in a way I could not explain, I understood something I had been trying to avoid since the moment I opened my door that morning. I was already past the point of safe, and whatever came next, it was not going to ask for my permission. The word safe echoed in my head long after he said it. Not comforting, not reassuring, just final, like something I could not return to no matter how much I wanted to. And I stood there trying to steady my breathing, trying to find something to hold on to that still felt like mine. But everything about this place, about him, made that harder with every second, and I crossed my arms without realizing it, more for balance than defense, asking him what exactly that meant for me now, because if I was no longer safe, then what was I supposed to be? And his gaze did not waver, not even slightly, like he had already anticipated the question before I asked it. "It means you are no longer invisible," he said, and the words landed heavier than anything else so far, because I had spent my entire life being exactly that, unnoticed, blending into the background, surviving by not drawing attention. And now he was telling me that had changed, that something about me had been marked without my consent, and I shook my head again, more firmly this time, telling him that I did not belong in whatever world he was talking about, that I had a job, a life, responsibilities that had nothing to do with him. But there was no reaction, no dismissal, just that same quiet certainty in his expression, and he stepped closer again, just enough that I had to tilt my head slightly to keep eye contact. And for a second I noticed the small details I had missed before, the faint line near his brow, the steadiness in his breathing, the complete absence of hesitation in everything he did, and it struck me how different he was from anyone I had ever known. Not louder, not more aggressive, just more certain, like the world adjusted around him instead of the other way around. "You think this is about belonging," he said, his voice low but clear. "Is not." And I felt my pulse pick up again because that meant it was something else, something I had not even considered yet, and I asked him what it was about then, even though part of me was not sure I wanted the answer, and he held my gaze for a long moment before responding, like he was deciding how much to say, how much I needed to know. "It is about consequence," he said finally, and that word stayed there between us, heavier than all the others, because it did not leave room for argument. It did not ask for understanding. It simply existed, and I exhaled slowly, looking away for the first time since I entered the room, my eyes landing on the city beyond the glass. Cars moving, people walking, everything continuing like nothing had changed, and it felt almost unreal, like I was watching a version of my life I could no longer step back into. And I realized then that he was not trying to scare me, not in the way I expected. He was telling me the truth as he saw it, without exaggeration, without apology, and that made it harder to dismiss, harder to fight. And I turned back to him, asking what he expected me to do. Because if I was already caught in this, then I needed to know what came next. And there was a pause, just a brief one, before he answered, "You stay where I can see you." And something about that made my chest tighten all over again, because it sounded simple, almost reasonable. But underneath it was something else entirely, something controlled, something permanent. And I opened my mouth to argue, to push back, to remind him that he did not get to decide that for me. But before I could say anything, there was a soft knock at the door behind him, and the man who had spoken to me earlier stepped in just enough to catch Adrian's attention, speaking quietly, controlled, and I could not hear the exact words. But I saw the shift, subtle but immediate. The way Adrian's expression sharpened just slightly, the way his focus changed from me to something else entirely. And when his gaze returned to me, there was something new there, not softer, not colder, just decided. "It seems your timing was not the only thing that changed last night," he said, and I felt my stomach drop because I did not understand what that meant yet. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty: whatever consequence he had been talking about, it had already begun. The shift in his expression was small, almost invisible, but I felt it like a drop in temperature, like the air itself had tightened around us. And I stood there trying to read something in his face, anything that would tell me what had just changed. But Adrian was already moving, not rushed, not reactive, just deliberate in a way that made everything else seem slower by comparison. And he turned slightly toward the man by the door, listening without interruption, his posture still relaxed, but his attention sharp, focused in a way that made it clear whatever had been said mattered more than anything else in the room, including me. And that realization should have made me feel relieved, like maybe I could step back. Maybe I could disappear from this situation before it went any further. But instead it made something else settle in my chest, something colder, because if I was no longer the center of his attention, it meant something bigger had just entered the picture, something I could not see yet. And I took a step back without thinking, my instincts finally catching up to everything that had been happening since the moment I opened my door that morning. And I told myself this was my chance, that whatever this was between him and his world, it did not have to include me. But before I could take another step, his voice cut through the space again, calm, controlled, but impossible to ignore. "Stay." And I froze. Not because he raised his voice, not because he moved to stop me, but because of the certainty in that single word, like it was not a request, like it had already been decided. And I turned back slowly, meeting his gaze again. And there it was, that same intensity from the night before, but clearer now, sharper, like whatever hesitation might have existed before was gone, replaced by something more defined. And I felt my pulse pick up again as he stepped closer, closing the distance just enough that I could not pretend I was separate from this anymore. "Someone is asking about you," he said, and the words landed harder than I expected, because they were not dramatic, not exaggerated, just direct. And I blinked, trying to process what that meant, asking him who would be asking about me, because no one knew me, no one had a reason to care. But he did not answer right away, his eyes studying me like he was measuring how much I could handle, how much I needed to know. And that hesitation told me more than any explanation could have, because it meant the answer was not simple, not harmless. And I felt my hands tighten at my sides as I realized what this really meant. This was not just about him anymore. It was about me. About the fact that I had been seen, connected, pulled into something I did not understand. And I shook my head slightly, more to myself than to him, trying to push back against that reality, telling him that it did not make sense, that no one would connect me to him, that I had been careful, that there had been no one else there. But his expression did not change, not even slightly. And that was when I understood the difference between my world and his. I thought in terms of chance, of coincidence, of things going unnoticed, but he did not. His world did not leave things to chance. And he took another step closer, his voice lower now, quieter, but somehow more intense. "You are thinking like this was random," he said. And I felt my breath catch, because that was exactly what I had been doing, clinging to the idea that this had been an accident, a one-time mistake that would fade if I ignored it long enough. But the way he looked at me made that impossible. "It was not," he continued, and those two words settled into me deeper than anything else, because they erased the last bit of distance I had been trying to hold on to. And I swallowed hard, my mind racing as I asked him what that meant, what I was supposed to do now, and for a moment he did not answer, just watched me with that same steady gaze. And then he said something that made everything inside me go still. It means they saw enough, and I felt the ground shift under that sentence, because I did not know who they were. I did not know what they had seen, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever line I had crossed last night, it was no longer just his world watching me. It was someone else's too. The words "they saw enough" echoed in my head like something unfinished, something I could not quite reach, but could feel closing in, and I stood there trying to make sense of it, trying to find a version of reality where this still had an explanation that did not involve me being pulled deeper into something I never agreed to. But the look in Adrian's eyes made that impossible, because he was not guessing. He was not speculating. He knew. And that certainty settled over me heavier than anything else. And I felt my breath slow without meaning to, like my body was adjusting to a situation my mind had not caught up to yet. And I asked him what exactly they had seen, my voice quieter now, not because I was afraid to speak, but because I was starting to understand that the answer mattered more than I wanted it to. And for a moment he did not respond, his gaze shifting slightly, as if weighing the room itself, the distance, the silence. And then he stepped closer again, not rushed, not threatening, just controlled. And I noticed how every movement of it seemed intentional, like nothing about him was ever accidental. "Enough to know you exist," he said, and that sentence settled into me in a way that felt colder than anything before it, because existing had never been dangerous to me before. It had never been something that required attention or protection or consequence. And I shook my head slightly, trying to push back against that idea, telling him that people see each other every day, that it does not mean anything, that it cannot possibly mean what he is suggesting. But he did not argue, did not correct me. He just watched me with that same steady focus until the silence itself became the answer. And that was when it hit me. This was not about being seen in the way I understood it. This was about being noticed in a world where attention had weight, where it carried meaning, where it could not be ignored once it existed. And I felt something shift inside me then. Not panic, not exactly, but awareness, sharp and undeniable. And I took a step back again, needing space even if it did not change anything, asking him what they would do with that information. Because if they knew about me, then they had to have a reason. And for the first time since I arrived, Adrian's expression hardened just slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to feel it, like the room itself had drawn a line I could not see. And he exhaled slowly before answering. "They will look closer," he said, and the simplicity of it made my stomach tighten, because it left too much open, too many possibilities I could not control. And I tried to imagine what that meant in practical terms. Someone asking questions, someone watching, someone connecting pieces that should have remained separate. And the thought made my chest feel tight, because my life was not built to withstand that kind of attention. It was simple, quiet, predictable, and now it felt exposed in a way I could not fix. And I looked at him again, searching for something, anything that suggested this could still be contained, that there was a way to step back from the edge I had somehow reached. And I asked him if there was anything I could do to stop it, to undo whatever had started, even though part of me already knew the answer. And he held my gaze for a long moment, long enough that I felt it settle into me like something permanent. And then he shook his head once, slow, final. "No," he said, and that single word carried more weight than anything else, because it closed every door I had been hoping was still open. And the silence that followed was different from before, not just heavy, but settled, like something had been decided whether I understood it or not. And I realized then that this was the moment everything truly changed. Not when I found him, not when I let him into my apartment, not even when his men came to my door, but now, standing in front of him, hearing the truth without anything softening it, because this was where the illusion ended. And as I stood there trying to steady myself against a reality that no longer felt optional, Adrian spoke again, his voice quieter this time, but somehow more certain. "So now," he said, his eyes locking onto mine in a way that made it impossible to look away, "you stay close." And I felt my breath catch, because it was not a suggestion, it was not a precaution, it was a decision that had already been made. And for the first time since all of this began, I understood that staying near him was not just about protection, it was about becoming part of something I could no longer step outside of. The words "you stay close" did not feel like protection anymore. They felt like gravity, like something invisible pulling me into a center I did not choose. And I stood there trying to hold on to the last piece of myself that still believed I could walk away from this, that I could step back into the life I had before last night. But every second I stayed in that room made that version of reality feel further away, like something already fading. And I forced myself to speak, telling him that he could not decide that for me, that I had my own life, my own choices, even if my voice did not sound as strong as I wanted it to. And for a moment he said nothing, just watched me with that same steady gaze, and I realized something that made my chest tighten all over again. He was not trying to argue with me. He was waiting, not for me to agree, but for me to understand, and that was worse, because it meant this was not about convincing me. It was about time catching up to a decision that had already been made. And I shook my head, taking a step back again even though there was nowhere to go, asking him what staying close actually meant, because I needed to hear it, needed to know exactly how much of my life he was about to take. And he exhaled slowly, like he had expected the question but did not rush the answer. "It means you do not go back to how things were," he said, and that sentence landed heavier than anything else, because it confirmed what I had been trying to deny since the beginning, that there was no reset, no return, no pretending. This never happened, and I felt something shift inside me then. Not panic, not anger, but something quieter, something more dangerous. Acceptance starting to take shape in the space where resistance had been, and I hated it. Hated how quickly my mind was adapting to something that should have felt impossible. And I looked at him again, really looked this time, at the way he stood there like everything around him was already under control, like outcomes were not uncertain in his world, they were chosen. And I realized that was the difference between us. I reacted, I adjusted, I tried to survive, but he decided, and the world followed. And that realization settled into me deeper than anything else, because it meant I was no longer operating on my own terms. And I asked him one more question, the only one that still mattered. What happens if I do not stay? And for the first time since I walked into that room, there was a pause, not long, but enough to feel deliberate, like he was choosing his words carefully. And when he answered, his voice was quiet, controlled, but final. "Then I cannot protect you." And the simplicity of it made my breath catch, because there was no threat in it, no raised voice, just a fact stated without emotion. And I understood then that this was not about forcing me. It was about reality as he saw it, a world where choices had consequences whether I accepted them or not. And I stood there in the silence that followed, feeling the weight of everything settle into place. The night in the alley, the knock on my door, the ride through a city that no longer felt like mine, all leading to this moment where I had to decide what I was willing to risk. And I closed my eyes for just a second, trying to find something familiar, something steady, but all I could feel was the shift, the undeniable change that had already taken hold. And when I opened them again, meeting his gaze, I realized something that made everything inside me go still. I had not stepped into his world by accident. I had been pulled into it the moment I chose to stay, and now there was no version of my life that did not include him standing at the center of it.